Welcome to the Neutral Ground Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Meyer. Stop me if you've heard this before. Everything today just seems so argumentative and contentious, and everybody just seems to be putting out extreme ideas. And honestly, I'd rather just kind of stay neutral, just stay in the middle. So what is it that's making our culture so extreme? Well, I have a theory about that. But first, since this is the inaugural episode of the podcast, I thought I might give just a little bit of background information on myself so you know where I'm coming from and so you can get to know me a little bit. I was born and raised on Long Island, New York, and I've been teaching college courses, mainly composition and literature, since roughly 2005-2006. I received my PhD from the University of Arkansas, Woo Pig Sooie. If you're familiar with the culture over there, if not, you're probably like, what the heck was that? Was that a sneeze or something? No need to be afraid. The focus of my research is mainly in what we would call the American Renaissance. Authors like Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, Douglas, Dickinson. But I'm also familiar with the early Americanists. People like William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation, John Winthrop, the City Upon the Hill, and moving into the 18th century as well with the American constitutional framers. I also go into a little bit of modernity as well with some T.S. Eliot, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Flannery O'Connor, and I bleed over ever so slightly into postmodernism with some Ralph Waldo Ellison. But, again, the main focus of my research is mostly in the American Renaissance. However, I'm also consistently fascinated by the heroic narrative and how heroism tends to manifest itself throughout history. Take, for example, these Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. That didn't just come out of nowhere. Those popped up at just the right time, just when people felt like they started to need to believe in heroes again. And you better believe when we talk about Neomodernity, which is the current historical movement, when we talk about Neomodernity, we're going to have to spend some time to talk about this heroic narrative surge that we're still in right now. Currently, I teach at the University at Albany in upstate New York in the program in Writing and Critical Inquiry, and I love it. I love my job. We're very fortunate in that we get to teach mostly freshmen, incoming students, with the occasional sophomore, junior, or senior, but for the most part, we get the brand new students who come into college. And it's wonderful. I love challenging these students to think, to leave the surface level of thinking behind and the reactionary world that we've somewhat been trained to embrace, and to engage in a process of deep thought. And I try to set this up from the very beginning by having two main rules on my first day. And if students have taken my class, they'll remember me saying this, hopefully. Rule number 1, no cell phones. Now, I am kind of happy to report that with this new generation, Generation Z, that's not really as much of a problem as it used to be. I think millennials really enjoyed the toy aspect of the smartphone, the newness of it at the time. But this generation, dare I say, they're almost happy to use the classroom as a way to get away from the phone for a little while, which is great. The second thing that I tell them, and the most important one, is the world doesn't need 20, 50, 100 more of me in it. It just needs one of them. You see, I don't want to create acolytes and followers of my religion and I don't recommend anyone follow my religion. There's nothing of substance at the end. The world needs just one of them, because it's that uniqueness of the individual that we want to preserve. Yes, we want them to be conscientious and good citizens of the world, but we need to preserve the uniqueness so that we can preserve diversity of thought. That's how we move forward as a species. And so I try to instill in my students the idea of, I'm going to throw ideas at you, big ideas. And you're going to have to engage in a process of deep, engaging thought. And at the end of that process, you're going to have to make a decision. How much of that thought or philosophy do you want to apply to yourself in order to make you the best version of yourself? Not just for you, but for the rest of us. And if that thought or that philosophy doesn't make you better, or doesn't make you see the world or humanity in a better way, get rid of it. That's deep, engaging thought. However, today, it seems like our culture does everything it can to make sure that we don't have deep, engaging, and meaningful thought. We reward reactionary thinking. Tell me if you've never felt this before. You're speaking to someone and you're trying to get across an important point, and you can almost feel that the other person is not really listening. They're just kind of writing a script in their mind. This is a rebuttal script. Because today, it seems to be more important that we fight with each other, that we somehow win a competition or win a debate, what the Greeks called philonikeia. Nike, as in like the company Nike, which is the love of victory or love of competition. When in reality, what we need more of is philosophia, like philosophy, love of wisdom. And there's a big difference there. If you're building a script to rebuke whatever it is I'm trying to say before I even finish saying my thought, there is no wisdom there. There is no genuine exchange of ideas. There is no dialogue. And therefore, nothing has actually happened. I don't get to hear my idea out loud. I don't get to hear it challenged and maybe made better in a meaningful way. I simply get, rebuked, and that's it. We need to get away from that. And so in order to do that, I try to instill a process within my students. And here's how that process works. Here's what deep critical thinking actually sounds like. You hear an idea or a philosophy or whatever it is, and you put it in your mind, and then you give it your own language. And that's so that you can maximize your understanding of it. Once you have it maximized in your own language, you bring it out to the world, and you look at how that idea manifests itself out in the world and how you use that idea in the world as well. And as you observe how that idea is utilized in the world, you think on it and you think, what is happening here? What do I see? Does this idea make me see humanity better? Does it make me a better person? Does it help clarify some aspect of the human condition? If so, how? How does it do that? And you create your own kind of philosophy on the idea. And then comes an important step. You have to let that idea, that new philosophy that you just created about the idea, you have to let that out into the ether. And social media does not really promote this idea well. putting it out there as a tweet or a post doesn't really work the same way as what I'm going to propose. You see, what's better is even if it's in an empty room, which sounds crazy, but hear me out, even if it's an empty room, vocalize your new philosophy out loud, let it bounce off the walls and the surfaces of the objects in the room, and then come back to your ears. And I promise you, you will hear and understand your philosophy in a new way. And this has happened to me in the classroom as well. This is kind of the interesting and exciting part about speaking in the classroom. Sometimes I'll have this great, amazing, all-encompassing theory in my head that I want to bring to the classroom, and I'll say it out loud, and it'll glide past the students, and it'll bounce off the back wall, and then it'll come back right past bewildered faces, and it'll hit me, and I'll say, wow, that was stupid. That did not work at all. And sometimes you need to hear it so that you can rethink on it, reflect on it again, and maybe even recompose it. And that's also the beauty of being able to speak with another person. You throw the idea out to that person, and if they're a good listener, then they're not creating the rebuttal script in their mind while you're speaking. And at the end of you throwing your idea out to them, you ask them a simple question. What do you think? Don't ask them, do you agree or do you disagree? That creates that kind of reactionary thinking that I was talking about before. We don't want that. Just ask them, what do you think? And then let them go. Let them speak. If they ramble or meander a little bit, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that because we're trying to create thoughtful, meaningful dialogue. And if they push back against your idea and challenge it, all the better. Then it's upon you to not create the rebuttal script and to listen and take in their challenge and play with it for a little while. But you see, deep, thoughtful, meaningful thinking takes time. And we don't seem to promote time today. Something you hardly ever see or hear in conversation today, whether it's on social media or person to person, is, I don't know. Or let me think about that. And so I try to instill in my students the importance of thinking as a process. And sometimes you can best clarify your thoughts by writing, because writing is the most, I would say, precise form of communication. Because I can speak to you right now through a microphone, and I can throw in the occasional stutter in order to try to figure out the most accurate word that I can use at that moment. And if I'm in person with someone, I can use my hands. I'm very much into using gestures while I'm speaking. I can do that, and sometimes that body language can help the other person understand more accurately what I'm trying to say. But on paper or on a computer, every word has to connect with the previous one in a meaningful way. Every sentence, every paragraph, every page. And it forces the author to organize thinking. So where did this contentious atmosphere in culture come from? Well, I have a theory about that. And I'm going to propose that theory here, and then we'll use other episodes of the podcast to really clarify it and make sense of it. But here we go. It's my theory that what we're all feeling, really, is the pull of historical movement. Historical movements have a kind of force almost like gravity. And you need a certain amount of force in order to overcome gravity. Well, I think that's no different when it comes to historical movements as well. Whenever I teach historical movements as part of my class, I always use a rubber band as a kind of metaphor for historical movements. You see, you remember how you would take a rubber band and you'd put it between your fingers and then you'd pull them back and try to hit each other, and then somebody would yell at you and say, stop it, you're going to poke somebody's eye out. And then you'd continue shooting them and someone would almost get hit in the eye and you'd all be like, whoa, they know the future. We better stop. Well, historical movements are kind of like these rubber bands. The further you get into a historical movement, the more you pull the rubber band back. And the more you pull that rubber band back, the more tension and potential energy you build, until the force you use to pull that rubber band back is so much that it snaps it and converts that energy to kinetic energy that must move. It must be dispersed. And of course, we know how rubber bands actually act, right, or react. It's never that it just kind of falls to the side. No, they react violently. They snap back and sometimes can hurt your fingers. And that's sort of what happens, I think, with historical movements, major historical movements as well. We're just constantly pulling a rubber band back until it snaps very violently. Look, there's a reason why many of our major historical movements tend to either begin or end around violent events like wars or revolutions. So, how exactly does this work? Well, I know it's really trendy right now to hate everything that is postmodernism, and there's plenty to dislike. Don't get me wrong. When we talk about postmodernism in a future episode with more, specificity, you're going to hear plenty of things that I dislike about postmodernism. But there's also tremendous good that happens in postmodernism as well. And so I try to teach my students that major historical movements are neither really good nor bad in of themselves. They're simply things that we learn that move the species forward in a positive manner, and there are things that we experience that we never really want to experience again, that we should be learning from in order to avoid in the future. Let's take a popular one, the Enlightenment. And, scholars disagree all the time about when it begins and when it ends, but for our sake, we're going to say very late 1600s, early 1700s, probably more accurate, all the way into the late 1700s in America. And of course, the Enlightenment, for the most part, is an age of reason, right? We're going to use rationale to better understand the human being and the human experience. And what's not to like about that? We tend to value rational human beings. And of course, if you can, you want to use as much reason as possible for your life. However, again, picture the rubber band being pulled back. Everything's reason, everything's rationale. And ask yourself a very important question here. How much of the human being's existence can be purely based on reason, without much connection with emotion or much connection to even just experiencing the human condition from outside of reason, right? We have relationships sometimes that don't really make much sense. They're not rational relationships, but they're important and we love them. And we have feelings that sometimes seem irrational to others, but maybe later on they'll make sense. And so what ends up happening is you pull that rubber band back so far that eventually the human condition, the human species basically says, I can't just be a human in reason. I need to feel something. I need to know that I can have meaningful emotional connections to the world. And thus, the rubber band snaps, and we enter into the age of Romanticism, roughly the late 1700s in Europe, and then reaching all the way through to probably just prior to the Civil War in the 1860s in America. And this is an age of emotional connection, connection to nature, but also connection to the human being and how we experience life. But there's also a subgenre in Romanticism that's quite interesting, that's kind of a carryover of the Enlightenment. And that's the Dark Romantics. The Dark Romantics, authors like Byron, Blake, the Shelleys, and then in America, Poe, Melville, Hawthorne, even stretching over into Dickinson. These Dark Romantics were fascinated by the transformative nature of knowledge. Now, today we have the often said cliche of knowledge is power, and it's a cliche because it's actually true. Knowledge is power. However, for the Dark Romantics, they saw knowledge as being transformative. And we tend to think that if you're transformed by knowledge today, that's a very good thing. It has a good connotation. But the Dark Romantics saw something much more potentially horrific in it. They were fascinated more with divine knowledge. Things like in the Garden of Eden, you have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what divine knowledge would do to the individual who could harness it. For them, it had a destructive effect on the human being once he or she was exposed to this kind of dark knowledge. Think for a second, if this sounds a little crazy, think for a second about a time that you found out something about a friend of yours. And once you found out that negative thing about them, it forever changed the way you viewed that person and changed your relationship to that person. That's the kind of dark, transformative knowledge that the Dark Romantics were interested in. It's out of Romanticism that we get one of our most commonly seen villainous characters, or sometimes complex characters, in movies and books and whatnot. We get the mad scientist, the individual who is going to use divine knowledge to create life in a laboratory and come close to actually destroying the world because of this, right? You get Shelley's Frankenstein, and in Hawthorne you have things like The Birthmark and Rappaccini's Daughter. So really fascinating figures that have stayed with us. But again, all the while, as we're walking our way through Romanticism, that rubber band is being pulled back. And we start to ask, how long can the human being be a figure of pure emotion? We become like a toddler in a store who's going through a tantrum by the end. And if you've ever seen a toddler, throwing a tantrum in a store, it can be kind of funny actually when it's not yours. But what ultimately happens, right? They're crying and crying and crying, and then they start doing that like wind down cry. And you start to look at them like, are you done? But what is that cry actually? Well, it's because their emotion has spent all of their physical energy as well, because being in a state of constant awareness of one's emotion is quite, or can be quite, debilitating physically. And so that rubber band snaps, and we enter into a new historical movement. Now, here's where things get a little bit dicey, because it's my belief that America, enters into modernism much earlier than the rest of the world because of the Civil War. Modernism is somewhat of a difficult movement to define or to pin, but for me and for my classes, I tend to define it through the lens of redefinition. In modernism, we want to redefine what it means to be human against the great atrocities that we've seen, against the heart of darkness of humanity. And so, in the wake of the horrors of the Civil War, because the Civil War, of course, you don't simply just have an immense amount of death and destruction, but you also begin to mechanize warfare in a way that hadn't been seen before, really. And so now we're starting to see more ways to massively destroy the human species. And at the end of the Civil War, America has to take a look at itself and say, how do we put ourselves back together here? What do we do? Now, as America is doing that in, again, the late 1860s, 1870s, moving into the 80s, England, of course, is going through the Victorian era. And then, when World War I hits, we start to see, or the rest of the world starts to see, what I think America was already learning or going through, which is this notion of war has forever changed. It's just too easy now to massively destroy people. And if we can't understand the evil within us as a species, or our potential for such horrific destruction, we're not going to be long for this world. And so the rest of the world enters into modernism and begins to try to redefine what it means to be human. We have the Geneva Convention, and even in our literature, we see this as well. Think of the modern authors, people like Stephen Crane with The Red Badge of Courage. You've got Fitzgerald, you've got Hemingway. These are not novels of grandness. They're usually novels about an individual trying to figure out, how do I stand up against the greatness? And when I say great, I don't mean morally, not morally. I mean in terms of its looming effect. How does the individual who is so small against the greatness of the world's suffering, of the world's evil, how does the individual survive when all of humanity seems to be so destructive? Well, you begin to look for pockets of goodness, and thus small gestures in modern literature become sites of great good. Something as simple as holding a hand becomes the climax of like a Hemingway novel. And something else happens in modernism as well. We start to redefine in modernism what heroism looks like. If you recall, in The Red Badge of Courage, you have a young soldier named Henry Fleming. And Fleming wants nothing more than to go into the Civil War and earn his glory. There's a very Homeric background there from like the Iliad. Think Achilles. And Henry Fleming is going to go and he's going to make a name for himself in battle. But there's this beautiful scene that's often overlooked. And that's when Henry has to tell his mother that he went behind her back and he enlisted in the Union Army and he's going to leave to go fight. And the narrator tells us that Henry's mother could have given him any number of reasons for why there is more glory in staying home. This is also seen in James Joyce's novel Ulysses, where the character Leopold Bloom, who's not a very great epic individual, becomes Joyce's epic hero, even when the scaffold of the novel is the Odyssey with a great hero like Odysseus. There's a scene where Leopold Bloom is sitting with a young man named Stephen Daedalus, and they're just talking in a place, and in that same place there's this really kind of braggadocious, pompous sailor named D.B. Murphy. And D.B. Murphy is clearly the stand-in in the novel for Odysseus. And Murphy talks about his adventures and his sailings and all that stuff, and it's mentioned that he has a son. And when Bloom asks Murphy about his son, Murphy has nothing to say. There's this tremendous disconnect between D.B. Murphy and his son. And we see this, of course, in the Odyssey itself, right? Odysseus is away while Telemachus is trying to grow up. But in modern literature, what it does is it makes Leopold Bloom the hero, because he's the individual who's home and listening to young people. And so the epic hero becomes the domestic hero. And so we continually try to redefine what it means to be human until, again, remember always that rubber band is getting pulled back. How long can the human being be in redefining mode, always looking for a coherent narrative for humanity to believe in? It snaps. We enter into World War II. And when World War II is finished, we begin postmodernism. Now think about this for a second, right? If you came out of modernism unable to find any coherent narrative, where does that leave you as an individual? It leaves you skeptical that any coherent narrative can exist, that can connect all of us. And thus postmodernism is built around skepticism. And what are we skeptical of? We're skeptical of any grand narrative that can propose an answer, like a clean, full answer to something. And so we become skeptical of institutions, things like religion, like governance. We become skeptical of language, of meaning, and so we deconstruct language and in essence break apart its meaning. Again, there is some good here in postmodernism. It's not by coincidence that we reach the heights of civil rights that we do in postmodernism, because that deconstructing of the major narratives is what allows individuals who were not able to fully participate in society, it gives them the way in to be able to participate as citizens. And there's no way around that. You had to deconstruct or break down the main narrative in order to do so. Additionally, if you're a stand-up comedian fan, like I am, stand-up comedy comes out of postmodernism essentially, or booms out of postmodernism, because the good stand-up comic looks at the world with a skeptical eye and asks, what's really going on here when we see this? But of course, there are the negatives as well. You see, in postmodernism, we lose a lot of what is sacred in the world. Everything is up for debate. Everything is up for mockery. And because of that, nothing can be held as sacred. And so, I think by the end of the 1990s, you start to have the beginnings of that rubber band starting to lose its grip a little bit on postmodernism. And I think we start to ask ourselves, can we be a species any longer without some sort of sacredness to us? And so when that rubber band snaps and we enter into, again, the movement that I think we're in today, Neomodernism, I think the first thing that we want to address is that loss of the sacred. And here's where I think we start to connect the dots with why everyone seems to be so contentious today. Neomodernism is a newer version of modernity. Neo meaning new, modernity. It's my belief that we've come around a circle almost. Think of a bell. A bell is a better example here, and think of a bell curve. I think postmodernism was at the top of the curve. And we're starting to make our way back down, and along the way we're going to hit upon a lot of these major historical movements that we just finished talking about. And the first one up is modernity. And so now we have neo-modernity, which again is about the idea modernity is about redefining. But of course, you never go through the exact same movements. You always have new ways of experiencing them. And so what is it that we're trying to redefine? Well, I think we are trying to redefine the sacredness of the individual narrative. And so each person has a kind of sacred self-narrative that they want to protect and to build. And if you have something or you hold something to be sacred, if anyone tries to attack it, it's not simply an attack on, say, our thoughts or an attack on, something that we only slightly believe in. When you hold something sacred, an attack on it is akin to an attack on a cosmological level, like at the level of the soul, which is why I think people are so protective of their sacred self-narrative today. And remember, there are a couple of ways that you can actually support your own sacred narrative. Two ways. One is to continually build it up, and the other is to, at times, tear other narratives, competing narratives, down. And so we will continue, I think, to have these kind of fights at the extreme levels until we realize that you don't have to simply occupy your self-sacred space at all times. You can come out to the neutral ground and pull from the great ideas that can be found on both sides, because both extremes, or any extreme side, can have interesting and useful ideas that we can use to better society and to better ourselves. But if you're standing on the wings of one of the extremes, you're forcing yourself into a corner from which you have to deny the good ideas of the other side, the opposing view, because you have to prop up what you believe is your sacred narrative. But you don't have to do that. The other problem is this: if everyone puts forward a sacred narrative, then nothing is sacred, really. When everything is sacred, nothing is. Because sacred space has to be treated differently than everything else. It's meant to enter into, preserve, and then leave. And that's why I started this podcast. That's why I want to give people a neutral ground space from which we can take ideas from great literature, great philosophy, build ourselves up, bring it out into the world, think about it, through the process that I mentioned earlier, and rejoin humanity in a meaningful way. Now, I will say this, like all historical movements, eventually, whether we do something or not, this is going to end, because all historical movements end. The question is, what will you have done with your time in this historical movement? Will you spend it on the extreme, burning yourself out, constantly defending, constantly attacking? Or will you come out into the neutral ground and simply live and help the rest of us, help humanity, build yourself up to be the best version of yourself? That's the purpose of this podcast. I ultimately want to have guests on my podcast, people that we can pull into the neutral ground and ask them to at least consider opposing arguments, to move them away from their extremes. However, in order to do that, I need your help. I need to build up my audience. So if you found the podcast episode interesting, or even if you think you might find it interesting in the future, support my endeavor to bring sanity back to discussion by doing any one of the following, or all of them if you really want to see the podcast flourish. Leave a positive rating, a nice comment, and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you're currently using to listen to me. You can also find me on the neutralgroundpodcast.com, where you can contact me with an email or a question, or even leave an audio comment that I might use on the air as a springboard for one of our thought sessions. Yeah, I'm actually really curious to hear what all of you think. Where is your neutral ground? I'm also on joemeyer.substack.com. That's joemeyer.substack.com. And you can email me directly at theneutralgroundpodcast@gmail.com. So I hope you enjoyed the first show, the first episode, and I hope you subscribe and stick around for more. Until next time, try to keep one foot firmly planted on the neutral ground, and have a great day.